situation that was recorded in John this morning. How often do we find it in the Bible, and how often do we find it in our own lives? Crowd gathers, accusations are made, fingers are pointed. There is a sudden rush to judgment, and it's not unusual. As I read this story in John, I can almost see the scribes and the Pharisees doing what they are doing because somehow they know it is right. It's interesting that as the story starts, they're ignoring their own sin and their own brokenness. All too quick as I am in my life, and maybe you are in yours sometimes, to point the accusing finger at somebody else when they're doing something that I think is wrong. The unfortunate thing, at least in my life, is that frequently I do that when I do not have recourse to all facts. You ever do that? Jump into the middle of a situation when you don't really know what happened and rush to judgment, making decisions about others. Maybe that's unique to me. I fit right in with the scribes and the Pharisees in the Gospel of John this morning. Sometimes at the drop of a hat, I am ready to presume that I know somebody else's motives, somebody else's intentions. I know the whole story, and sometimes at the drop of the hat, I am all too sure to try to tell myself that I know the absolutes of right and wrong, even when, in most situations, there are not absolutes of right and wrong. And so, like the scribes and the Pharisees, maybe not physically as they did with the woman caught in adultery, but certainly in my own mind and in my own words, and often in my own actions, I am all too quick to haul off others to the court of public opinion. That's a temptation in my life. And I have all kinds of good reasons. I mean, I can justify that on a number of grounds. I can justify it by blaming my parents. They're not here this morning, are they? I don't want to get shot when service is over. I mean, they raised 6 kids, and they raised us all to be pretty good human beings. I mean, we went to church and Sunday school every Sunday, and we knew that there were things that good people do and things that good people don't do. I can blame them because somehow they instilled in me from an early age that there are appropriate ways to act and to talk. Maybe even in a little way, there are appropriate ways to think and to be in relationship. And so it's easy for me to look back at my childhood and how I was raised and say, well, the reason I believe that and the reason I do that is because I had ingrained in me from an early age that there are right and wrong. And part of growing up is that you make those judgments for yourself about what is right and wrong. The temptation is to take judgments that are internal about what you're supposed to do and lay them on somebody else, so that the judgments become judgments about other people's actions and beliefs and motives. And I haul them off with the scribes and the Pharisees, hoping somehow that judgment, not justice, but judgment is done. Sometimes I am quick to justify the fact that I yield to the temptation to judge others because, after all, I am only speaking the truth. And what's wrong with that? Well, you know that there are times when speaking the truth can just get you in trouble. Do you like this dress? Absolutely. It's the ugliest thing I've ever seen, but I love it. You know what I mean? But the intriguing thing is we put this unbelievable premium on truth when it serves our need to give into the temptation to judge others. At least I do. And I can justify hauling before the court of public opinion on the basis, well, that it's only the truth. You have a problem with that? Of course, my problem is that my truth may not be your truth. And frequently my truth is not the truth of God as God would have me understand it in the world. That doesn't often get in the way. Sometimes I justify my quickness to rush to judgment on the basis that I'm only standing up for what is right. For my church, my community, my culture, my country, my world. And I am even egotistical enough to sometimes believe I rush to judgment because I'm only standing up to protect God, like God needs my protection. And I do it on the basis, you see, that if you don't do that, if you don't judge, and if you don't stand up for truth, eventually we're going to be on this slippery slope, and there will be no standards at all. I am good at coming up with all kinds of reasons why it's okay for me to join the scribes and the Pharisees in dragging the sinner before the judgment seat, and demanding that something be done about it. The problem in my life, and maybe in yours, is that when I slow down and step back and take a look at it, frequently I realize that it is not about justice, but it really is about judgment. Frequently, I join the mob mentality as the scribes and the Pharisees did. I participate in what I call modern-day lynch mobs, who substitute public character assassination for a rope on a tree. I join with the crowd yelling for somebody to be crucified. At least it isn't my Savior. Although frequently it is those who are created in the image of my Lord and Savior, and who are actually fellow heirs with me in the kingdom. You see, I gather with people because I want judgment on those who are broken, deep down inside. And I gather with people of like mind who are really, really trying to be careful to remove the splinter from another's eye while ignoring the beam that is in my own eye. Jesus talked more in the Gospels about God's desire that we not judge each other than he ever did about things that seem to occupy the time of the church today, whether it's church growth or sex or whatever it might be. It was important for God to help us know that this is a temptation in our lives. And it's a temptation that's always going to be there. Because, face it, folks, the world is like me, which means the world is a broken place. And there's always going to be ample opportunity to judge others. To somehow say they're wrong. I don't know about you, sometimes I think I do that. Maybe to protect myself more than anybody else. At least when I was a kid, and I'm not sure I've grown out of it as an adult, there were times when I was really quick to get my brothers in trouble because it made me look really good. And the temptation to judgment is there. It has been from the beginning. Remember the story in the garden? When the serpent tempts Eve with the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and she eats, and she gives some to Adam, and he eats, and then they go hide because they're afraid of God. And God comes looking for him. He says, "Why are you hiding? What have you done?" And Adam says, "I ate of the fruit of the tree. But don't judge me. It was her fault. She gave it to me from the beginning." And when God says to Eve, "What did you do?" She says, "Don't blame me. I ate, but it was the serpent's fault. He tempted me." Sometimes we think we can make ourselves look better by making others look worse. And that's unfortunate. Because you see, when we give in to the temptation to judge, what we're really doing is taking God's prerogative for dealing with the brokenness of the world and putting it on our own shoulders. I think it's interesting that Jesus could have joined the crowd that day in the temple. When they said to him, "What does the law say?" he could have stood up and said, "That's absolutely right. The law says stone her, and I come as the fulfillment of the law." Taken to its logical extent, he could have said that and then bent down and picked up the first stone stone thrown at him. According to the law, he would have been justified. But he doesn't do that. Of course, he could have taken the other option, which was to do nothing at all. And how many times in my life have I participated in judging others by my silence? By stepping back when it was happening and not saying anything because I don't want to get involved. And sometimes the silent voice of judgment is as loud as any others that we use. It's what the world hears when the church refuses to stand up and say, there are certain things that are wrong. Now, you know, that sounds like judging. But I think you can talk about actions without talking about people. You can talk about things that are happening in our culture that need to change without laying blame on others. And sometimes we are, quite frankly, I am part of the problem because I choose not to exercise my voice in opposition to those who have given into temptation to judge. It's interesting that Jesus takes a third alternative. He doesn't join the scribes and Pharisees in judging the woman, neither does he simply sit and say nothing. Oh, you think he's going to because he's drawn with his finger in the ground, and you can write books about what that means, and I don't think anybody knows. But eventually, when they push him, he looks up and remember what he says to them? Okay, you got it. Let the one of you who is without sin be the first one to throw a stone at her. And see, in the midst of the temptation to judgment, Jesus offers an alternative invitation to the scribes and the Pharisees. And the alternative invitation is the one that I need when I want to rush to judgment, and that is an invitation to look at my own heart. Not to look out there and figure out what's wrong, but to look in here and figure out what's wrong. And maybe that's the power of Lent. That for 6 weeks before Good Friday and Easter, we are invited to spend time to look inside of ourselves. Not to try to figure out what's wrong with the world, but try to name what's wrong with us. Because when we finally hit Good Friday and the cross, one of the things that we will hear is that Jesus went to the cross for the sins of the whole world. And I believe that. But the problem with that phrase, it gets in the way of my temptation to judgment. Because I can focus on the sins of the world. Maybe the power of Lent is that for 6 weeks, Jesus invites us the same way he invited the scribes and the Pharisees, to look at our own hearts. So that when we finally hit the cross in 3 weeks, and when we finally encounter the horror of Good Friday and what that means for a man to die on a cross, we understand that Jesus died for me. And see, if I were to wrap my mind around that it makes it a lot more difficult for me to give in to the temptation to judge. Because I understand 2 things. First of all, if I'm focusing on the fact that Jesus died for me, I don't have near as much time to figure out what's wrong with you. But the other thing I know is if I've done that self-examination and I know what's in my heart and I know Jesus had to die for me, then I also know that Jesus died for you and for the sins of the whole world. And that it is not about judgment. It is not about walking into a world pointing fingers at what's wrong and blaming and accusing. It is not about ourselves protecting ourselves from the slippery slope. It is about a faith that affirms that God is there to save the world. And that God does that not by judging the world, but by sending his Son that the world through him might be saved. So, in the next couple of weeks, I don't know what y'all are going to be doing with your lives, but I know what I'm going to be doing with mine. I'm going to be spending some time resisting the temptation to judgment, not by trying not to judge. That's hard to do. I've got all those reasons why it's okay. But by instead focusing on the invitation of Jesus to look into my own heart. Figure out those times and those places when I'm broken and when I need not the judgment of Christ, but I need to hear from Christ what Christ said to the woman. Neither do I condemn you. Amazing thing is he could have said that to the scribes and the Pharisees, but he didn't say it to them either. I don't think he says it to me. And I know he doesn't say it to you because of his amazing grace that trumps the need for judgment. We close our worship this morning